Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Nessie's Dead. As always, we are your hosts, Spencer and Helen.
Hey!
Hello. I've got my cup of decaf coffee and in a spooky vintage gravestone-themed mug, so I'm all ready.
All set up. I guess we're ready to just hop in and take the plunge, huh?
Yeah.
So, for tonight, I will be covering the chilling camping experience that occurred to Scott Johnston and Sean Farmer.
Speaking of chilling camping, just really quick, let's just give this moment to tell our listeners, do not go in the woods alone. Camping is scary. Stay away from all of that.
Don't go camping. With that being said, this case is also known as the Appalachian Trail Killer. Are you familiar?
Yes and no.
Okay,
so know of, but not detail.
Okay, good. So
you can jog my memory and fill me in on pieces of information.
And I will.
You will.
I will,
You're taking
honey.
me camping tonight.
I am taking you camping.
Great.
But before we do get started, I just want to let everyone know that this case does contain very uncomfortable and graphic details of the point-by-point accounts of what Scott and Sean experienced when they encountered the trail killer. So, on the day of May 6, 2008, best friends, 39-year-old Scott Johnston and 33-year-old Sean Farmer went on a fishing trip in Dismal Creek, Virginia, which is part of the Appalachian Trail. Now, the two best friends, they had frequented this trail for many years. On this trip, Scott decided he was going to go down to the trail early. He wanted to go ahead and get in some fishing, just kind of enjoy the peace of the surroundings of the area. Afterwards, the plan was to go ahead and meet Sean back at the campsite in the evening. The area they were in of Dismal Creek, this is a very secluded area, so it's not the type of place that you're going to run into many campers. So when you think of it, don't think of like a big campsite where you've got lots of people visiting. It's a very secluded, alone area.
I'm all for going into nature. It's just when it comes to something like this, especially in Appalachia, I feel like there's this, I don't know, I find it terrifying.
Yeah, same. If I was going to go on a camping trip, I would like to go something at least, kind of where they have those little cabins set up and they're kind of a little bit spaced apart, or an area where, people are setting up their tents the same way. And you're going to see somebody walk by every now and then. Maybe they've got a little bathroom at the end of the trail for people to use. Or if I was going to go
I need my own bathroom.
Right. Or if I was going to go out into some kind of secluded area, I would like to be with an entire group of people, not just like one or two or three friends, maybe an
not
entire
to say
group.
That anything that happens is anyone's fault.
Yeah.
But
you just gotta
safest in numbers.
Yeah, you just gotta be safe if you're planning on doing these kind of events. With it being that type of area, while Scott is fishing, he finds it odd that there happens to be a man across the way that's beginning to approach him. Scott was described as a very friendly guy, and so he decided that he should just go ahead and introduce himself. Scott approached the man and greets him, and the man introduces himself as Ricky Williams. Scott describes Ricky as scraggly and kind of gaunt looking. He appeared as if he had been living maybe even in the woods for a few days. He was a bit thrown off though, since Ricky was wearing an expensive camo jacket and new hiking boots, and he also had a very friendly dog at his side.
That's odd. Wasn't he?
Yeah.
He's older?
Yes, and he's an older man too, so yeah, you are right on that.
Do you know how old, or an estimate?
Yeah, so he would have been in his 50s.
Oh, okay. Really?
Mm-hmm.
I felt like from images I've seen.
Yeah, and I sent you over some photos as well. And so, yes, the older man.
Much older.
He does look much older, which is, again, if you can see how frail he looks in those photos and disheveled. It's a different kind of, from a nice dressed man to his actual appearance.
Where did he get those nice clothes?
Exactly. So Scott then he decides he's going to carry on a conversation with Ricky. Things are going fine during this conversation. Now, he did start noticing a few red flags about Ricky, but he kind of pushed those ideas back, thinking that maybe Ricky was an alcoholic or a drinker. Just his demeanor seemed a little bit more pushed towards that kind of behavior. But although he did see a few red flags, Scott didn't feel threatened. And he actually gave Ricky some fish that he had caught earlier during that day. And the conversation continues. Scott even points out to where they're staying as well.
Oh.
I know.
Scary.
Back at the campsite that afternoon, Sean Farmer had arrived, and he began setting up the campfire while Scott cleaned and prepared the rest of the fish he had caught earlier that morning. Now, Scott was known to be a chef, so he was doing all the cooking over there.
Oh.
And preparing the food. At this point, the fire is roaring when Ricky strolled up to the campsite. The two men, seeing him, invited him over to join them for dinner. He hangs out with them for 2 or 3 hours. They're chatting it up. He's befriending them. Sean recalls that he didn't think anything was off about Ricky and described him as being very charismatic, stating that anything that the two had talked about, Ricky kind of just knew something and was able to add to the conversation. He also described him as being very skinny, and he also noticed the dog looked a bit malnourished, but disregarding it, thinking perhaps the two had, maybe been in the woods for a while. Kind of the same thing that Scott thought when he saw him strolling up. As the evening went on, the men ate dinner together. They listened to music, had a few drinks, and they were having a great time around the fire. They did, however, notice that Ricky was drinking quite a lot, but still the friends didn't feel like this would become a threat. And they didn't get any notion from his behavior that made them feel uncomfortable with the situation. And again, if they both kind of thought he was a heavy drinker to begin with, it just logically made sense to them that he would be drinking more.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What was odd to them is they did notice that Ricky was hanging out for quite a while. And at this point, it's starting to get dark. Ricky had told them that his campsite was about an hour away. So they're kind of a little bit concerned here with he's got about an hour walk. It's dark now, but they again kind of brushed it off. Scott and Sean were very familiar with the area, and they knew they would be able to navigate in the dark if it was them. So they just kind of assumed.
I can't even imagine that. Navigating the woods at night.
Well, this is one of these spots that they frequented quite a bit. If they've been in this area for quite a while and they know where the creek is or where this area is, they figured they would know how to get back in the dark. So they thought maybe Ricky's the same way. Maybe he comes out here quite often and he knows exactly how to get back to his campsite at this time. As the evening drew on, though, the men decided they were just going to go ahead and call it a night. However, this is when their time spent with Ricky would take a wild turn and become a horrific event for both Scott and Sean. As the men call it a night, Ricky gets up from the fire and whistles for his dog to follow suit as he walks towards the nearby woods. So this was around 8:30 in the evening now. So it was nice and dark by this time. Both Scott and Sean at this point are still sitting at the fire with their backs turned to the woods, and Ricky was walking towards those woods behind them. Only a few moments went by after Ricky seemingly departed when, without any warning, Sean would be stunned by a massive boom. His ears ringing. He shot up from his seat. He's confused, stumbling around. Sean then realized he has been shot in the left side of his head.
Where did it hit? Do you know?
Yeah, so it went through the back of his head, and the bullet got lodged in his sinus cavity. So it didn't go all.
Survived that?
Yeah, so it didn't go straight out. It got lodged. At this point,
God.
Yeah, it only gets worse. At this point, he does realize, oh my God, I've just been shot. He's a pretty big dude. He's around 320 pounds. He's not a small guy. So this impact didn't force him to collapse straight away.
Wow.
Yeah. He stumbles around a bit and he turns around to see what has just occurred. Upon turning around, he sees Ricky standing behind him, pointing a .22 caliber pistol at Scott now. Scott at this time was fleeing towards a cluster of trees located behind their tent. At the time he was running, Scott had no idea that Sean had been shot or what was even taking place. The sound of the boom was enough to spook him, and I guess fight or flight kicked in, and he got up and instantly booked it for the tree line. Yeah.
Do you know what? Something that is so crazy about this, and it makes it a little scarier, but also makes it a little sadder. It's like these two guys just meet this random older guy in the woods.
Yeah.
They're hanging out and they're having a good time. And the guy's got a dog and they're sharing food and just hanging out. And it's like normal. Like you mentioned how Ricky was able to contribute to the conversation really well.
Yeah.
And, you know, like real friends, like they just hit it off instantly. And then he does something like this. It's crazy to me.
It is crazy. And you can see how they would have been caught so off guard. I mean, they've been hanging out with him all night. They thought that they met a fellow camper and, you know, had company at their campsite, passing the time.
And like the weird things they noticed weren't like weird. It was just like, oh, he might be kind of a weird guy, or, oh, he's kind of crazy looking, but not like crazy in the eyes, like going to shoot you. But I mean, I guess now that's what it was.
Exactly. But yeah, like you said, it just to them seemed like maybe, you know, he's been out there for a while. It seemed like he knows his way around out here. And also, he's a heavy drinker, it seems like. But he's acting normal. He's contributing to the conversation. He's charismatic. Again, I feel like if I was in that position and I was with a group of friends, I wouldn't see anything wrong to, you know, hang out with the guy.
Well, maybe you and I would. If the mailman looks at me, if he even glances at me, I'm like, oh, I'm done. That's it.
I know.
He's loading me up in the mail truck and sending me somewhere and chopping my body up, and he's going to send it out in little packages all over to the U.S.
I know. That's where your brain goes. So you probably would have been like, he's not. We're not feeding him dinner. No, we're not. You need to scooch along.
I'm not victim blaming at all.
No.
But if a stranger in the woods came up to me, especially if he was a little disheveled looking, no. Yeah. Back up. Get away from me.
Yeah, but Scott and Sean, they were some friendly guys, and they do this a lot. You and me, we don't go camping, so that might have been something that would startle us. But for them, they're out here all the time. They run into a fellow camper.
I do feel like typically campers and hikers, those kinds of people are typically on the friendlier side.
Yeah, they do. They kind of have that little bond there. So that's exactly what these guys assumed they were experiencing.
Which is why it's sad.
Yeah, it is very sad that they were caught so off guard like this in these horrific events that are about to unfold. As we continue into these events, with Scott running, he at this time had no idea that Sean had been shot or what was taking place either. Once he reaches the tree line, he realizes that he himself has been shot as well. So he notices blood. He starts feeling around on his neck, and he does find the wound. At this point, he instantly proceeds to plug the hole with his right index finger to try to eliminate the bleeding. So
genius.
He's got a hole in his neck here. Scott then looks back at the campsite to witness Sean face to face with Ricky. Ricky standing about 10 feet away from Sean, and then shoots him a second time in the chest. They now realize at this point how much danger they are actually in with this stranger. And it's at this point Sean decides to make a run for it to the Jeep nearby, which luckily he had the keys in his pocket to the ignition, and the front of the Jeep was pointed like facing out from the campsite. So it would be a quick getaway.
Good.
So he goes ahead and he starts making this dart for the Jeep while Ricky is reloading his gun. And Scott at this time is running into the woods, and Ricky is now pursuing him. It's at this point that Scott himself realizes this is his one chance to get away. So he starts running towards a trail that will lead to the road. But meanwhile, this whole time, he's still got his finger plugging this hole in his neck. I can't even imagine the shock and terror knowing you have this injury, this hole in your neck. You know it's graphic blood is just going everywhere, and you're running, which is speeding that up. And you're fleeing from this killer who is now like coming straight for you. It makes
I wouldn't even think to plug the hole.
I would probably no, I would pass out and die.
I would not. I would give up. But see, in those moments, you have so much adrenaline going through you. Like, was it Sean or Scott the second one who was shot? Scott
was the second one. So he ran off, and Sean was fleeing to the Jeep. So
the fact that he was able to not even really notice that he had been shot initially.
Mm-hmm. I think, knowing from my perspective, everyone's like, oh, your fight or flight will pop in and you're going to run or you're going to start fighting. You're going to know what to do. And that adrenaline's going to kick in. Honey, anytime anything happens to me, boom, I hit that floor. I pass out. Or like if I get scared and I'm caught off guard, I freeze. My ass just goes in a straight freeze. Like,
I mean, I've never been in this kind of situation. But in anything where I'm suddenly scared, it's usually freeze.
I freeze. Or if there's an accident, I cut my knee open or cut my hand on a knife. I have to know to get to my knees as fast as possible because I'm about to pass out.
Really?
Yes, if I see the blood.
That, of all people, that's ironic.
I know. I'm done. So the fact that they're able to do all this, to me,
they're superheroes.
Wow. They are, to me. They really are. Well, they're superheroes to begin with, imagining that they
camp.
I just can't. I couldn't imagine. But continuing on, at this point, as we're saying, Scott and Sean are severely wounded. They are trying to escape this crazy man. We have got Sean, he's fleeing in the Jeep. Scott, he's running down the trail to the end of the road. And at this point, Sean was able to go ahead and get away in the Jeep. And he does see Scott at the end of the trail. In which, yes, and at which he is able to stop and pick him up. He pulls him into the Jeep and he lays him flat down. But Ricky is still close behind them. And he's chasing him down. He then is able to get up to the truck and aim the pistol at Sean again on the driver's side of the car. At this point, Sean is being shot at. Bullets are flying everywhere. And as soon as the bullets stop flying, this is when he goes ahead and he pushes it into overdrive and they shoot down the side of that mountain. You got to think, with the amount of wounds that they have, both men are bleeding out rapidly. They can recall that there's so much blood, it could actually be heard sloshing around on the floor of the Jeep as they were taking the sharp turns down the mountainside.
Oh my God.
To me, that's absolutely
really gets me.
Yeah. It's something right out of a horror movie. I feel like if I saw that in a horror movie, I'd be like, okay, that wouldn't really happen. But yeah, it was that. Yeah, it did. So maybe I'll rethink when I see things like that in horror movies.
Yeah.
That can actually happen. At this point, you got to think they're out in the middle of nowhere. So they're about 5 to 6 miles away from any home and another 40 miles from the nearest hospital.
Ugh.
I know. So the two men are proceeding to drive down the mountain. And if you think about how it is, like when you're driving down a mountain, there's no guardrails, there's sharp turns, and there's drop-offs.
That's the kind of drive that, like in the movies, again, going back to movies, ew, that is even more terrifying.
Yeah, and the drop-offs on the sides would be around like 45 feet on either side of the road. So if you don't take that sharp turn correctly, you're going straight down the side of that mountain.
They're doing all of this.
Yes.
Being hunted down by some random lunatic.
Yes.
They're both bleeding out, probably on the verge of death.
Mm-hmm. And they're also in a panic because they do know that one of their trucks has been left behind with the keys still in the ignition.
Oh,
so
no.
They know at any point they could start seeing headlights behind them.
And they still manage to take these scary turns correctly. Wow. Can't even figure out how to do a roundabout half the time while driving.
I know, right? Don't ask me to parallel park. It's not happening. I just have to go home. It's not going to happen. I'll go home. But at this point, with all these circumstances the men were facing, they're doing pretty well. It wasn't until Sean begins to lose his eyesight in his right eye, he starts blacking out. Sean's tongue had also swollen to the point that he wasn't even able to speak to Scott. So there's no communication from him. And this was due, like we said before, that bullet had entered the back of his head and was lodged into his sinus cavity. So that was causing his tongue to swell up. So with Sean now not capable of taking the wheel, Scott then takes over the steering wheel and he steers the Jeep while Sean is still controlling the gas and brake pedals.
I can't.
Best friend teamwork there. By some miracle, the two men are able to make it to the first house in sight that had lights on. They parked the Jeep and Scott was able to make it to the door, which he begins pounding on that door. The homeowner of this house was Melissa Miller. At first, she was caught off guard with the fury at the door and the pounding, and she thinks this could be a home invasion. Like, again, she's still out there too. She's only 5-6 miles away from a campsite out in the Appalachian. She does look out and she recognizes that this is Scott, her friend's ex-boyfriend. So she actually recognizes who this is.
What?
What are the odds that that's the first house? Because even if he would have went, let's say, to another house, they may not answer the door. They may have just called 911 and waited because you've still got this bloody man outside your house. Yeah. You don't know how he got injured.
And everything with this case is absurd. Like the odd, like that right there, that's miraculous.
Very miraculous. So after she recognized who it is, she immediately opens the door and she jumps into action. So she helps Sean out of the car. She starts helping with their wounds and 911 is called. So she's plugging up their wounds. She's doing everything. 911 does quickly arrive and they arrive by helicopter and they load up Scott and Sean to head over to the hospital. While the men were in the helicopter, they were both pretty much unconscious at this point. Sean, he can actually recall hearing the paramedics reporting that he didn't have a pulse. Imagine how terrifying. Hearing this, I would have thought I already died and I was like outside of my body or something. With the two off to the hospital, the police realized that they need to get up to the campsite and find this crazy person who has just attacked these two men. Now, the homeowner recognized Ricky's description that Scott was able to give her. He was still able, with the bullet wound in the side of his neck, able to give a description to her of this man.
Who are these men?
I know. I don't know. That's crazy to me. And she did recognize this description from a missing persons poster at the grocery store. Yeah, so she's given this description, and in her brain, she was like, I know exactly who that is.
What are the odds?
What are the odds? So the cops waste no time shooting up the side of the mountain and end up at the campsite looking for Ricky. Meanwhile, Ricky had hijacked Scott's truck and fled back to his own campsite, where he was trying to collect his belongings as fast as he could in the dark. He, however, was unable to successfully collect everything with it being so dark. He got back in the truck and got on the road. It's here where he is spotted by a state trooper. The trooper chased him, and after a short car chase, Ricky ran off the road and flipped over into the embankment.
Oh.
Yeah. The truck...
Doesn't he also survive?
He also survived. The truck was completely totaled. They do recall him being totally drunk, very injured, but very much alive.
Nobody can die in this case. That's crazy.
It seems like it. I don't know what kind of river water everybody's drinking at this campsite.
Wow.
But maybe you and me could check out some of that river water over there. Well, so they go ahead and they detain Ricky. But since he was injured, he is now taken to the hospital as well. And he is actually taken to the same hospital where Sean and Scott are being treated.
Of course.
Of course.
Is it the same room? considering the strangeness of this.
I absolutely hope not. I did not hear anything about the same room. That would be...
I wouldn't be surprised. This case is so odd. That
would be terrifying. Imagine waking up from surgery or whatever, and you look over and there's Ricky right there in the bed next to you. At the hospital, Sean and Scott are taken to emergency surgery, and miraculously, they both survived the attack.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah, they're troopers. Sean was even in recovery by the next morning, as his injury, like we said, was that bullet hole that had lodged into his sinus cavity. And the gunshot wound that hit him in the chest actually kind of got caught in some muscle mass. So it wasn't able to hit his heart. It actually pushed the bullet away from his heart. The police were able to interview Sean and informed him that the suspect had been caught and that they believed he had tried to commit suicide by crashing the truck and is now in custody at the same hospital. So Sean knows what's going on, which still, just even knowing, I would be terrified. With this, the investigation now begins on to the suspect they have in custody. The man that they had taken in was identified actually as Randall Lee Smith. He was not Ricky Williams. So that was a complete lie he told to the guys. A little background about Randall here. In 1981, Randall had actually already been arrested for the murder of Lauren Ramsey and Robert Mountford. He pled guilty for 2 accounts of murder in which he had bludgeoned to death Laura with a piece of iron and stabbed her 13 times with a knife and long nail, and Robert, which he had shot in the head before burying them both in their sleeping bags. This is what actually gave him the name, the Appalachian Trail Killer, and this actually took place not too far from the campsite that Scott and Sean were at the time.
So were those other victims random campers as well?
Yes.
Oh, scary.
Very scary. So he did plead guilty to second-degree murder, and he was sentenced 33 years in prison.
33 years?
Just 33 years, which there were many protests outside of the courtroom, as Randall was actually the first convicted person of killing a hiker who had the opportunity to leave prison.
Yeah, why?
They said it's because he pled guilty. So because he pled guilty to it, he was given a lesser sentence than if he pled not guilty and it went to trial. It's kind of like a plea deal.
Ugh, I hate that. The lesser sentence should be we're not putting you to death.
Yeah, exactly.
If you kill people, you're not getting off. You don't get 33 years.
Well, it's going to make you even madder here in a second. In 1996, 15 years after he was sentenced, he was released on mandatory parole for good behavior. So he only had to stay 15 years out of the 33 years. And the way he killed those people, that wasn't...
It wasn't like manslaughter or defense.
That was a brutal killing.
Yeah.
So once he does get out, he returns home to Ingram, and he stays with his mother at her house. He is monitored with an anklet as part of his 10-year supervision. So it's not like they just freed him out to the wild. They did monitor him for another 10 years. In 2008, he left his home, taking a few belongings with him and his dog. So this is where the dog came from. About 6 weeks after he left home, neighbors noticed that he wasn't around anymore, and the police start putting up these missing person posters. So this is how she was able to recognize him based off of that poster.
Wow.
Which then brings us back full circle around to May 6th, where he meets Scott and Sean. So going back to Sean and Scott's encounter with Randall, the police investigate the area, and they were able to find some of Randall's belongings, which included his GED and birth certificate in the bushes, a copy of law enforcement radio 10 codes, and a police scanner, a plastic mold of the area with several marks on it in pencil. So kind of like a little mold out of the camping area.
Ew, weird.
Yeah. They also found several pairs of eyeglasses, clothes of various styles and sizes, 8 pairs of women's underwear, and over 30 knives. So
token,
we don't know.
Because I assume it's not all his.
No, they were several of the clothes were various styles, sizes, He doesn't need 8 pairs of women's underwear. And there were several pairs of eyeglasses. So either he was robbing campsites or taking things from victims. We don't know. I mean, they did run DNA on the clothing, underwear, and knives that were found, but it came back with nothing. So it was inconclusive.
Okay, damn.
I know. They also searched the markings on that map, and they couldn't find anything that would correspond with why those areas were marked. So again, that led them absolutely nowhere. The clothing, no DNA. The markings on the map, nothing. They didn't lead to anywhere. During this time of the investigation, it was a period of 5 days. Randall was arrested and hospitalized at that time. He does die of natural causes at the age of 54 at the New Rivers Regional Jail, just leaving an array of unanswered questions. We'll never know why he had all these clothes. What was the map for? Why?
Frustrating.
Very frustrating. Why he just decided to suddenly attack these men that he had befriended. So it's not even like he just stumbled and they were complete strangers to him and attacked them in the woods. He took the time to get to know them and befriend
I wonder
them.
if that is a part of his MO, like get them to warm up to you and then strike.
Now, the first murder that he did, that's a whole other case in itself that could be covered. There's a lot of details that go into that.
You should cover that.
We should. It's a mention in this because we're focused on Sean and Scott. But it in itself is a whole other case that can be covered as well. So that puts an end to the case. The victims did have some thoughts about Randall. Scott commented that he believes Randall's death was due to karma. And Sean stated that he believed there were more victims that have not been identified.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure of it.
I'm sure of it too. After their miraculous survival, they are both able to return to work again, go about a normal life. One thing that is different about himself, Sean states, is that he is no longer the nice guy to strangers and never will be. Now, despite all of this horrific events and everything that Sean and Scott have been through, they still do spend their times together and their evenings fishing and camping and taking trips to Dismal Creek together.
They still go to the same spot?
They do. They still go to Dismal Creek together.
They are something. That is intense.
It's very intense.
And I was hoping they were still friends because there are some survival stories where the victims do not remain friends because of the trauma.
Yeah.
Something like this can very easily bring you closer together to the people you experience it with or tear you apart very easily because it is like too much.
Yeah, because different people deal with trauma differently, and sometimes that can clash. Mm-hmm. And somebody
or the reminder, almost.
Yeah,
like, you remind me of that night too much.
Yeah, that too. But I mean, they're still going up to the same spot at Dismal Creek, hanging out, fishing. Part of me wonders if they sometimes go by the old campsite and been like, "Oh man, this is where we met old Randall, right here."
You know what? I bet they have, at least once.
Oh, I bet they have.
Considering how strong they seem and considering the fact they still go up there.
Yeah, they seem like some very tough-minded dudes, for sure. But yeah, that is the case. I think Randall has done this more than once. The town he lived in, actually, is right offside of these trails. And he had been known to go out to these trails a lot. So he was very familiar with the area, the trails. I don't think these 4 were his only. I think he got caught with these 4. And I still think if Scott and Sean didn't survive, he would have been prime suspect considering his previous crime with the other 2, considering the fact that he did go missing. And of course, like we said, he was scrambling to try to find his items and flee. So even if the cops weren't chasing him or looking for him at that point, if he would have killed Scott and Sean, I think he would have still tried to get out of there and probably still left his GED and birth certificate in the bushes, which is an odd place that you would have your GED and birth certificate, but okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I feel like, I'm not super familiar with this area or even Appalachia itself, but I'm sure that there are plenty of missing person cases because there are a lot.
Yeah.
A lot from just the woods in America. But there are a lot in Appalachia, and I wonder if he played any part of that.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of places that you could hide somebody in those woods. And if a hiker is gone for days, weeks, and they're not able to find them, and there's no telling how far he could have took them out and buried them. And
Yeah.
so at that point, they just disappeared because with all the clothing and eyeglasses, amount of knives too, 30 knives, that makes me also think he could have taken those from the victims as well, because who goes out and purchases that many knives to have at their campsite? To me, it just seems like it was part of that collection of things that he had probably taken from other people along the way. But that is the story of Sean and Scott. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not camping ever.
Yeah, no. Unless it's with a large group of people and in a public camping area.
Yeah, in a cabin.
Yes. Oh, I love a good cabin.
And electricity.
Even then, when I went camping in Oklahoma, it's still a little frightful out there.
Yeah.
I mean, there were other cabins beside us, but it's still out there and you're still surrounded by woods. I'd do it again, though.
I would, too, but just definitely cabins. I've never done tent camping or anything like that.
To me, I hate tent camping because you can't see what's going around outside of you. Like if you're
on the ground,
the only thing you can really do is unzip that zipper and poke your head out.
Yeah, and that's the one and only entrance and exit.
Yeah. It's terrifying.
Especially in like Appalachia or a national park.
I would actually feel more comfortable sleeping in one of those, how people make their own tents where it's literally just like a tarp between trees and then they set up underneath it, because then I could see everything. Yeah. And I could run if I needed to rather than having an enclosed tent. Anyways, I guess unless you got anything else to add.
I think that was the scariest thing we've covered.
It's terrifying.
I do remember this one made me nauseous when I first heard about it. Mm-hmm. And you definitely sparked that in me. As you're telling the story, I was like, oh, that one. Okay.
Yeah. It's the whole finger in the wound thing to me that just makes me woozy.
That, yeah. And the blood sloshing.
Oh, I forgot about that. Thanks for putting that back in my head.
The bullet hole in the head. That's intense.
Oh, yeah.
I also feel like answering or getting a knock on the door a scary, big, crazy banging on the door kind of knock in the middle of the night, and you live out in the woods. That is horrific on its own. And then to look outside and see someone panicked, covered in blood.
That you know?
Yeah, well, that makes it a tiny less scary. Like, oh, Scott.
But still, it's like, oh my God, Scott. What the hell happened to you?
I also can't get over the fact that everything's lined up so oddly, from the woman, Melissa, recognizing, just knowing the description and being like, oh, I saw a missing person poster on him.
Yeah.
And, oh, the victim, I happen to know him. And it's my house that he happened to bang on. And the fact that they were able to get in the truck together, and the fact that they were able to
get down the side of that mountain.
Yeah. I mean,
it's wild. And it's just the fact that, and with Scott's injuries, he's still able to give such a good description that she knows who he's talking about. After this traumatic event, he can still recall enough information. I would have just been standing there. I mean, he's also witnessing them trying to save his friend, who, of course, his tongue is swollen up.
Well, that's kind of like the case I just covered with the Phantom Killer.
Yeah.
If anyone has not yet listened to that, please go listen to it. And one of the victims, she was shot in the face 2 times and survived. And she was able to make it to a nearby neighbor's house. And she was able to say what happened before collapsing. It's just crazy.
I don't know how these people do it.
No.
I don't think I have that in me. Well, I say that I say that because that's never happened.
Yeah.
Now let's knock on wood that never does happen.
Yeah, it won't.
It won't. I think we should wrap her. I think she's good.
Yeah, let's wrap it.
All right. I think with all that, that's the end of it. And I guess we're going to say good night.
And pleasant nightmares.
Night.
Bye.